So we have a second speaker tonight. I'm super excited. My friend James Spivey is from Charter and doing some really awesome stuff. I'm very excited to see. It's on one of my favorite subjects, which is on ngrx entity. This is something that I have used quite a bit, and the teams that we work with have used quite a bit. And so this is a really great way of helping to organize your data a little bit better on the client side. And so with that, I give you James Spivey, ngrx entity, and the forgotten package. All right, give it up for James.
Thanks, B-Love. Yeah, so I wanted to talk on ngrx entity. Who here knows what ngrx entity is? Handful of people, okay. Yeah, so I called it the forgotten package because it is kind of the forgotten package. It's been out for a while. I really like it. I think it's a really useful feature for a lot of us that do sort of standard operations. So I figured I'd do a deep dive. We could sort of get into it a little bit more and talk about what do we see here. Actually, sorry. I think our live share needs the microphone.
I turned you on.
All right, thank you. I want to make sure I get the presentation for you right. All right, so first, who am I? My name is James Spivey. I'm a CTO, an architect, co-founder. I do a bit of everything. Right now I've been contracting with Charter since January, helping them out on their enterprise team, doing a lot of cool stuff over there, really driving that project as much as we can. Thank you to my Charter cohorts for coming and joining me. Always fun to have some coworkers around. So let's talk a bit first about Redux and ngrx and about what Redux specifically is. So that we kind of get a baseline, who has worked with Redux stuff before, ngrx? So most everybody, you're pretty familiar. Functional programming, right? Immutable, unidirectional, all really important things for a large scalable enterprise. Stuff that we want to look for. A big part of this too is it is a single source of truth. I think that's what they really advertise a lot. We've all gone into a project where we've seen all of the state management done through various services, and you push the service and you pull from the service, and maybe somebody else is messing with your service and you don't really understand. There's a lot of those kinds of problems. The nice part about Redux is it really simplifies this process into a one-way directional flow of data where we know that's our single source of truth and it won't get impeded upon, and it's easily traceable about what's going on with it. Basic premises in Redux: stores, reducers, and actions. That was briefly covered by Jose. I know a lot of people here have heard the term boilerplate. We'll talk a little bit about it. Entity is a response to that to a degree. But we have our stores, we have our reducers, we have our actions. This was a Facebook premise that came out of Flux. Dan Abramoff and Andrew Clark are the people who created the Redux pattern, really pioneered it for React and those sort of libraries, which brings us to ngrx. Is a collection of libraries. It utilizes RxJS, which we all know and love because we're all in the Angular community. Thank you, Ben. Love you to death, buddy. It was really designed so that by Rob Wormwald, who is also an awesome guy. You should come see him. He was here for the Angular Denver. He's hilarious. He did the keynote. Absolutely follow him on Twitter. He doesn't maintain it anymore, but he was sort of the godfather, if you will, of this. And his premise was, let's take React and let's make it more Angular friendly. Let's put this into the Angular style of doing things. So RxJS being a big part of that, right? We do everything through observables, so we should be utilizing them in full. It has a number of libraries in it. A couple of the terms you've already heard, so store effects. There is the router store, which is Angular specific, right? So that as things in the router occur, we can track that through our state management system, do things with it, preload, get side effects, that sort of stuff. Store dev tools, which was sort of what you saw there, that plugin that you asked about. That is through the store dev tools, so that will actually show you your history of your actions and then what that did to your state, so you can see your before, your after state, what your current state is, and actually track where your actions are occurring. There's a number of really great talks on why that's important. The term boilerplate around your actions is more actions is better because then you have more traceability about where your stuff came from. Entity, which is what we're talking about here, always fun. And then schematics. Schematics being sort of their newest one, and that's to help you generate your state based off what they believe are best practices and help you produce things for that. So you can find all that here under platform. That one's kind of important because they mono-repoed it. So the platform area is where they keep all of these packages under, as opposed to some of their older ones. You'll find them in other repos. Those are no longer actively maintained. The platform is where you find everything. It's the all-encompassing umbrella. So what is entity? Clickbaity title, just to get you guys all excited about this. I know you guys are super excited. Entity is an entity state adapter for managing record collections. Basically what that means is this is a tool to reduce the boilerplate. Sorry, Brandon, please don't block me on Twitter. If you've ever seen him at NG he talks about that a lot. He hates the term boilerplate. The idea here is that this package is designed to help you with standard CRUD operations and reduce what people deem as boilerplate, the stuff that you do over and over and over again in your reducers, the stuff you don't want to do, your read, update, and deletes. It is also extremely type safe, which is really, really important. As my team knows, I hate the keyword any. I don't really like it. I don't really let people use it because I think it's a bad practice, right? We can get into a lot of trouble, especially with runtime null pointers when we allow that to be a thing. So I try to keep any out, and that's what I really like about Entity is that we can have type-safe control through the entire process of create, read, update, and delete so that we always know we're doing the right actions and we have less bugs that come out of that. It is also extremely extensible and flexible. So while it does give you standard operations for a collection, it allows you to do a number of other things that you're used to doing in your state management that are really important, such as like error states, loading, all the other things that you want to append upon your state. This doesn't prevent you from doing that. Using this adapter isn't going to kick you out of the stuff you're used to doing and want to have in your state management. So I think that's really important. Really easy to add are sort of standard commands here. It's just at their mono repo, so the @ngrx and then entity. So if you want to give it a shot, that's the fastest way to get it going. The three main features of ngrx entity: interfaces, entity adapter, which is the main sort of brains behind all of this, and then the selectors that come out of that. The interfaces that we'll talk about, we're going to talk about all these in detail. I'm going to try to do as deep a dive as I can for you here. We will have questions at the end, so we'll definitely go through a QA if you get lost or want to ask more. The interfaces are really what derive how you're going to operate with everything. We all understand what an interface is. Really useful tool. They base everything off of sort of these standard interfaces that you'll interact with. Our adapter, as I said, is the brains, so it's going to be the thing that we interact with in both our selectors and in our reducer. And then our selectors are actually, it's not necessarily a part of entity, but the part that comes out of the adapter really drives how these selectors work. So we're going to get into that as well so you can really see how it is. I also have, I'm going to present to you something, everything that's in this presentation is in their docs, so you can find all the examples in the docs. So I try to keep it as close to those as possible so that when you got in there, you'd be able to look at them and go, this looks familiar, I've seen this before. There is going to be a little bit at the end where I'm going to diverge from the docs from sort of a way I like to do things, a system that I've kind of come up with after working on some projects with Nathan Walker and some of the maintainers here and some of the ways of doing things. So it's going to be a little different, and I'll definitely highlight that for you. But just so that you're aware at the end, it's going to be a little different, and I'll show you why, and I think you're actually really going to like it. So, interfaces. The entity state, this is the most important part, and this is how you're going to basically base all of your state. This is the base interface for the shape of the state you're storing. So here we have either an array of strings or an array of numbers, and then we've got the entities here, which is a map, and it will either have an ID of a string or a number, and then this is our type safe right here. This is what's actually what you base all of your state on, and the reason that this is really important is that IDs is going to be an array, and it's just an array of either numbers or strings, and it will be sortable. And this is how we actually maintain the sort order in everything that's stored. And the reason we don't store everything is speed. So entities is a map, and that's a lot faster when we do lookups for CRUD reasons. It's much more performant to use a map than it is to use an array. So the array is to maintain the sort order, and then the map is what actually stores the values. So if then we want a particular value out of that array, we can use it to go look up on the map and get our value very quickly. So this means that if you're going to store a large, substantial amount of data that you really need accessible and it comes back to you as some big JSON array, You just dump it into entities, and it's going to handle all of this stuff for you. You don't have to worry about the map actions or any of that stuff. So we're going to get in a bit more about how all that works, but this is the basis of how it all goes for you. So the big ones being the speed advantage. So I'll let you read that for a second there, kind of in sort of order. So let's look at an example. We're going to use the standard examples from their repo. It's going to be standard user storage. So we're going to have our user interface, which is an ID, has an ID of string and a name string. Then we're going to have our state, which is the thing you've kind of seen a little bit from Jose's presentation about what your standard state with the things you maintain in it. And it's going to extend that entity state from ngrx using our type safe so that we make sure we're storing that entity of user. And then we can append additional things to it. So this is where you could put loading, errors, whatever you might need. Your roles, things that may be outside the realm of what's inside of your user entity, you can store them all here. We're going to use a standard one just for demo's sake of selected user ID, which could either be a number, or if we have strict checking, null or undefined. I'm a big fan of strict, by the way, too. If you put strict true on your tsconfig, it saves you a lot of pain later down the line.
It'd be number or string, right? Depending
Yeah, I messed that one up. I apologize. You're right. This is correct. This should be a string because this would be matching on that. So that's my mistake. The next one is entity adapter. As I said, this is sort of the big one. I know it's a little hard to see. There's a lot to kind of squeeze in here. This is the standard interface for the entity adapter. It is the brains behind how ngrx entity works. It has a number of things here that are important and a couple that not as important. So let's talk about that a little bit. Select ID is the most important thing. You need to have that. What ngrx does for you out of the box is that in terms of how it knows how to build that IDs array and the entities array is based off what that ID is. But it needs to know how to get that ID. So the important part here is that we're going to have a function that you're going to pass in that entity that you have. So in our case, it would be user. And it's going to dig into that user object and return me the ID. And that will then build my ID array and then my entities map. So that's extremely important. You basically cannot use this without that function. Some of the optional ones, sort compare. So let's say that we want to have all of our entities sorted by last name. Well, this would be a function that would take user A, user B, dig into those objects, look at their last name, and sort by that. So that's really important. The get initial state, this is basically how you derive, if you're used to ngrx and how you do things now, you always set that initial state, the thing that you're going to have your defaults, like I'm not loading at the moment, I have not failed, all that sort of stuff. Get initial state will be useful for that. And then the last and most important is the get selectors. And we're going to talk about this one a little bit further here shortly, but basically that's how we're going to get all of this data back out in a standard method. That's the selectors part of that third branch we talked about earlier. So let's look at an example of this. This is my example with users again. So we have my adapter here. We're going to set it as a constant so that we can use it again and again and again. It is type safe, of course. I've got my select ID, so I pass it my user, and I'm going to bring back out that ID. And that's a string. Nailed it this time. And then I got my sort compare, user A, user B, and I'm going to look here. I got their name, and I'm going to sort. Standard 0, -1, 1 kind of sort compare here. And then our initial state. So we take our adapter, we get our initial state, and we pass it our initial state, which is that my initial option is that I don't have a user selected. So that's how we set our defaults and get everything up and going. So we've basically now essentially bootstrapped our safe. We are good to go. This is how you use the adapter in your reducers. So the nice part about this is typically where you get that boilerplate. The adapter is our tool for adding to that map and pulling out of that map. I've condensed this a bit from their examples. The adapter itself does a fair amount more than what's actually listed here. So I try to kind of condense it to make it actually visible to y'all. But the big ones, right, is add, update, delete, load, clear. So in this scenario, it has a function called add1. We take our payload of our user that we get back from whatever it is that we're getting. And we also have to do what with ngrx? Immutable state. So we have to give it our state object. And what that's going to do is it's going to add this user, and then this is going to return our new state object, because we never modify the existing state. We always make sure that we produce a new one. So the adapter makes sure to always give you back that new state. Same goes for upload or update. We're going to take user, We're going to pass our state, and we're going to get back our new one. Big ones for this is that you're passing the whole user object. And the reason for that is that select ID. It knows how to dig into that user from that select ID and figure out which one you're either adding or updating. So when it updates, because of that select ID, it's going to dig into this, find that ID, go find that in your map, and update the map accordingly with what you have now. So big things to be aware of that is if you're trying to update something and it got a new ID, you will have a problem with this because it will not find it then, right? You would fail it. So you need to make sure that you're removing and then adding in that scenario if it's getting new IDs. Hopefully your IDs aren't changing very often, but be aware of that as a caveat because that can be a thing if you have a system that functions that way or you chose the wrong ID. If you have an ID that's constantly shifting on you, that could be problematic. Here for delete, it's really easy. We just pass the ID. We don't need to know the whole object. We don't need to dig into it. That's just wasted resources, right? So we just have the ID, we go find the ID, we get rid of it. Easy peasy. For this, loading users, this is what you'll probably standard like hydrate, right? You pass your users, your state, hydrated, good to go. Now your map's full, your IDs are full, everything's sorted, and you're ready to go. So you can start using it however your functions might occur to display an inventory list, a user list, whatever. And then the clear ones, this one's kind of unique, right? We're not actually passing users in the clear situation. We're just clearing it, but we're also providing it our state object as we always do. But we can use this opportunity to destructure and then pass it some defaults back that we want to reset with. So for clearing, right, we know we're not going to have a selected user anymore because we have no more users. So we destructure state, and we take that selected user ID we had before, and because this is still type safe off the state, we know this exists, and then we give it back the default of null. And then that way, everything's reset. So if you had like loading or an error state, you could also use this to reset that and go back to square one. And frankly, you can do that with any of these. If you have like loading situations, you can do that with any of these. It's just destructuring an object, same deal. So the selectors. There's a lot to these, but they're actually pretty simple. This is the interface state for them. It gets a little confusing, and we'll talk a bit about more. Actually, I'll go back and kind of explain this first. All of this was designed to be very flexible for you for advanced usage. So you saw this part here that says select state. It allows you to pass a state object after you've initially defined it. This is not a practice most anybody uses, but I just wanted you to be aware of it so you would see it. And so why I mention that is in this scenario, you see the same thing here. When you look at these, it makes you feel like you have to pass the state, but that's actually not how this is going to work through that destructuring process. So we have some important ones, select IDs, which is either that array of strings or array of numbers. We have our dictionary, which is, this is their term. It's not actually like technically a dictionary. If you look at the interfaces in their repo, it's just a map. But that's our type safe map. Then we have select all, and what this does is it returns everything that's in that map as an array sorted by what your sort compare function was. So this is really useful if you're gonna have like a user list or something like that. You don't have to select the entities and then figure out how to turn them into an array and do that whole nonsense for you. They've got a utility function for you to do that. And then select total here, it's just the number count that you have in your array at that moment. So that way if you had a user count, something that was really important to you, you could do that, and that'd be a good way to have that. And these are basically, I look at these as the base that you'll use for all of your extended selectors. Most of us are used to not having very basic selectors. I personally use selectors more than I use reducers. I think they have more power in reusability as Momoy selectors. That means that they're very reusable to have that snapshot of data. And I don't like doing a lot of manipulation of the reducer. I'd rather store the data the way it came and then do manipulation as it comes out, rather than doing manipulation and then storing it. Your use case might be different. That's just how I prefer to do it. Everyone has a slightly different way of doing it. But I look at these as sort of the base, so you can use these then to build selectors off. You know, normally we just do select state, and then we grab a bunch of stuff and we do a lot of modification to it, kind of how you saw there. The way to keep our selectors a little more simple is to have this method of, you know, grab me my array, or maybe I just need one thing out of the entities. Let's do it that way. So we can look at examples of these. This is a debate that I had with B-Love back there a couple of times. There's different ways of doing this, and typically what you'll see in the docs, and the docs have even changed beyond this, so this isn't even what they show anymore. This is kind of how the bottom half is kind of how the standard works in examples. So you used to see this in their docs, and this is kind of the way, which is we call our get selectors, and then we destructure everything and alias them to functions that we'll reuse elsewhere. So what this does is get selectors returns me select IDs, select entities, select all, select total like you saw, and then we alias those to use elsewhere. And the reason for that is, and the reason the bottom example is more common is typically in ngrx you export everything in your file, and there's no structure to it, right? These aren't classes. So it's just a ton of stuff you're exporting. And you're either doing bad practice of, import star and everything in it, from state or whatever the sort of practice is, or you're importing individual things. You got this giant import, a ton of stuff in there. So the reason that aliasing occurs most typically is because it means that if you've got multiple pieces of state in a component or a service somewhere where you're selecting, you can differentiate between what's what, right? So we don't get confused about what I'm selecting. We want to make sure that I'm always selecting users versus my inventory, something like that. It's for clarity's sake. Personally, I find this very confusing. I don't think that's visually very easy to look at. I think there's too much room for typos, confusion, and I also like standards. So if I'm going to have a lot of state objects, I want the shape of my state very easy to work with. I want when my developers come into the state, they know that they're going to have certain things available to them, like select IDs, select entities, select total. I want those things to be standard names so that if I import my state, they're going to look at that standard and go, I've got these 4 things and I know I've got them. So like loading state, I want it always to be select loading. I don't want select loading, more or something else. I want it standards, because then it's very easy to bounce between different levels of state and know how you're operating between those different levels. So you see my note there about preferring not to destructure. Let's look at a complete example of how all of this works. We've got our namespace here, and this is sort of how I define things. This is my ideal. This is what I said is a little different from what you'll typically find. And the reason I like this is that it makes my imports nice and clean. It's very easy to operate with. And I think it also makes the ability to reason about what you're operating with very straightforward. You kind of see this a bit. Jose showed it a bit in ngrx. Austin got it right in saying that you have state contains things, and you do stuff with state. If I've got selectors, I'm pulling something out of state, so it should be named under state. So all of his selectors are under the state class. The examples in ngrx don't necessarily match that, and that I don't like as much as a style. Because for me, if I'm getting loading, I know where I'm getting it from, which is my state. I'm not getting it from my effects. I'm not getting it some random class. I'm getting it from state, so I want to name it that way. So the big thing for me was putting it under a namespace. This is a thing you don't see very often. It's a standard I picked up a bit from Nathan Walker, working with him for his presentation for ngconf. And I thought it was a really, really smart way of encapsulating everything that we work with. So what you do is you wrap it all under namespace, and you still do all the standard export stuff that you're used to from the examples. But then when you do an import, you just import user state, and then it's user state.adapter, user state.initial state, and then user state.select state, user state.select IDs. It makes it a lot more easy to reason about what you're pulling, especially if you've got 5, 6, 7, 8 different pieces of state you're trying to coalesce into one big thing. I'll get questions at the end. Is that all right?
Okay, sure.
Cool. And I can come back to all these slides, so I'll move back for you. So let's look at this example. Again, we're sort of back to our initial state that we showed before. Standard stuff there, right? Our adapter, same deal, although this time for condensing state, I took out the sorting. And then our initial state, same stuff you've seen before. Now we get into selectors. So type safe selector, create feature selector. This should be pretty straightforward stuff. You're used to this from ngrx. And then we have our adapter where we're getting our selectors. I only pulled the entities just for this one time for example's sake. You can pull all 4. There's no limit on that. And then here, I used just this initial one that you're used to where you get the state out of it. It's a standard selector. It has nothing to do with ngrx entity. So it's pretty straightforward. And then I use select selected user. So here, I take my select entities, and then I get my select user ID, and then there's my entities object. And because it's a map, I just pull that ID and we're good to go. So then it's very, very efficient. I'm not looping 10,000 items in there, right? I'm just grabbing from the map the one thing I wanted, and then for type safe reasons, I return undefined. Let's say our user are selected becomes unavailable because memoiz things happen as changes occur, right? So if I clear this out to null, that would clear this, and then I would return nothing, so that's a failure. So if I don't have an ID, I should always be returning something. So this is a strict mode thing. So if you're not used to that, that's why I was doing that. In the example, it doesn't do that, but that's just a thing to be aware of. So that's kind of my complete example, a bit of how I like to do things. Again, not the standard you'll see in the docs. You can certainly ask me more questions about that one. I think it's a really, really great way, and you should definitely consider doing this. Even if you're not using Entity, think about implementing a standard like that. It'll help your teams immensely. I found it helped my teams a lot. So where to learn more? Ultimate Angular, ultimateangular.com, Todd Moto, phenomenal guy. Just got certified to be a race car driver, because, you know, we're all bored, so why not just add some more stuff to our pile? He has a free YouTube video about it, so you can find it here. I'm going to show these slides, so you'll be able to get all this information, so don't feel like you have to type that all out. And then Angular University, also another really good resource. They have an awesome email blast that they send out with a lot of free guides, a lot of free information, really deep dive into different things. So I highly recommend following them. And they also have a free YouTube video on this. So you should check out both of those. Really great resources. People to follow, Mike Ryan and Brandon Roberts, as mentioned. They're going to be out here in January. Phenomenal guys. I absolutely love hanging out with them. They're a joy to talk to. So I highly recommend you get the VIP pass and hang out with these guys because it's worth it. Follow them on Twitter. They have lots of good random thoughts. And then, of course, please follow me. I don't tweet as much about interesting things, but I tweet about lots of random stuff, so that's exciting. And now QA, so what questions do you guys have? You have a question?
Yeah, I was just asking about the namespace. So that's something that TypeScript has then?
Yeah, that's a TypeScript feature, right? So it'll compile out. You won't have that in your source code that you compile, but it allows you to sort of maintain a collection of one thing rather than having a lot of different stuff.
Sure. I just overlooked it, and that's the tip of the day.
Yeah, I like it. I mean, I sort of have implemented, as my team knows, every file should have one class. I think files should be sort of condensed. It's easier to reason when there's only one thing that's coming out of a file. Anytime you find a TS file that's exporting a dozen different things, it gets very confusing, right? Like if you're trying to look for a particular thing to go maintain, typically your first thought is, let's look at the file name of, let's look at there's a function that's failing in my debug code. How do I get to it? Well, I'll start typing that thing out in the file name looking to find it. Well, if I've buried a dozen things in one TS file that I'm exporting, it's really hard to figure out where that thing is. If my file exports one thing, it's much more logical and reasonable for me to be able to then figure out what's in it. So this, like I said, was a thing. I didn't invent it, I didn't come up with it, but it was a pattern I saw, and I thought it was really, really good. And it's a pattern ngrx doesn't really follow that I think ngrx was trying to solve. So it was a thing that they were working on as, let's make this more Angular-like. And I think that's one of the other things I hear a big complaint about ngrx. It's not very Angular-like, doesn't have decorators and all that stuff. Well, these small bits of patterns are what help you get there. Shoot.
So you're not really introducing the reducer pattern here to accomplish CRUD operations on a collection, right?
One of the arguments for why Austin started in GXS was he wasn't a fan of reducers.
Right.
And reducers are a big pattern in Redux, though, is I can then do all my modifications and then return my new version of state because we don't mutate what we're doing. Only side effects can have any amount of mutation technically. So this was really just to reduce the complexity of your reducers. It was the ability to, rather than rewriting the same code over and over again about how to inject a single item in, there's a lot more to it than this, than just add, update, remove. There's patch. There's a number of other features that the adapter that has even deeper usage than I'm presenting here, just for time and condense. For that sake. It's just trying to make your reducers cleaner.
It's the bare minimum kind of
Right.
of what you have to invoke a reducer to do.
Correct. And so you can do additional stuff on top of this. If there's additional things that you need to do to accomplish what you're trying to do. But the idea, right, is let's make these files small, let's make them easy to reason, let's make them a thing that I can be approachable to looking at, as opposed to a ton of destructuring and a ton of array manipulation and all the other stuff that I think people tend to complain about when it comes to looking at big, heavy reducers.
I'm trying to choose right now on a side project whether to do, because my state management is getting unwieldy, whether I should do ngrx or XS or ngrx.
And that's a tough one. I mean, I'm a big fan of XS as well. I've used it on a number of projects. If you look at my GitHub, it's the same as my Twitter handle, so github.com/myspivey. I just recently got certified in blockchain, so I did an Ethereum certification. It was an academy course that took about 6 months. And we did a final project, and part of that was to implement a product. And in the blockchain world, it's all React and whatever. I wasn't a fan of that. Forget that, we're Angular people. So I had to do mine in Angular, right? So I also wanted to push myself a little bit more and let's learn some new stuff. So I put in GXS to its full paces just to see what it could do. And I'm a big fan. I think what Austin did, he actually handed it over now. He's a trader and left us. Austin, I'm saying that to you on the live feed. You're a trader, you left us for React. Yep, so he's handed over the lead maintainer role, but it's a great library. It does a lot of really cool things. There's definitely ways to get in a lot more trouble with it though. If you are not careful, it's much more, it is very easy to mutate stuff that you didn't intend to mutate and then get a lot of awful side effects because you did not realize what you were doing. Those actions can really cause you a lot of problems when you start trying to do a patch and then doing a ton of crazy stuff with that. It's a thing you can do and I've seen it done, so be careful. ngrx, I think I like it because it makes it very, very hard. It's not to say you can't do those things, but it makes it very hard to do those things. So it's based off your needs, your requirements. Again, we kind of talked about that in the last presentation about how far do you want to go. ngrx has a lot of overhead. I mean, I think I heard somebody talking about it earlier, like, oh man, I have an actions file, and I got an effects file, and I got this file, and the other file, and it just feels like a lot of stuff. For a large-scale enterprise product, that's a good thing. It's good to have a verbose but very clear collection of things. If you try to condense all of that into one file, I mean, I think all of us have seen, an Outlook app in a single file, and it was 10,000 lines long, and we're just like, oh, it hurts. So this is really designed to separate all of that. I complained to Austin a little bit about how easy it is to build a big state file. Because if you do have semi-complex selectors and you have a very large state object, it becomes a very unwieldy thing. So examples are good. Definitely dig into how to extract that into its own pieces and move them apart, which is I think what some of this is designed to do.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So the first one, I'm coming from Redux world, so there's a library called Normalize, which sort of prepares for that.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it doesn't really put anything to reducer, but it basically parses your...
Yep.
And one feature it does, it allows you to sort of kind of provide types. And for example, if user has like posts, it allows you to actually get them out too. So if you have another state for posts, so you can do that. Like, it's pretty simple to implement that. You add both new users and new posts. Like, is there anything like that embedded into this entity?
So you can actually if I'm thinking of the same library, you can actually use that with this.
Okay.
In terms of it being natively, I don't believe so, but I could be wrong. My best suggestion in that, so that I'm not a fibber, is to reach out to Mike Ryan or Brandon Roberts and ask them that question. They would be much more authoritative in that one than I would be, and I don't want to tell you the wrong answer.
Okay. Just was one use case when we had like several dependencies, like all these relations, and it was very convenient to populate everything once. Like, you just extend reducer.
Oh, so you had like two pieces that were kind of separated? Am I understanding that right?
Well, no, I mean,
So
they
like-
were just two like stores.
Mhm.
So they were like user and post, and
Got you,
it was
okay.
basically updating that. But sometimes you download users, and actually it automatically fetches some posts, and you just want
Right.
to put like
So
everything under ID.
what's really interesting about that, no, this doesn't have that built in.
Okay.
I'm going to try to authoritatively say that this does not have that built in. It's not really
Alright.
designed for that. It's designed for separated states. And they try to push that your state should not be so complex that they have those integrations.
Okay.
John Papa's tool might. John Papa wrote a library that kind of sits above all of this and actually hides most of this.
Okay.
It's like, it's the CRUD
Yeah.
king, if you will, and I heard it was supposed to be part of, Brian, did you hear?
Yeah, ngrx data.
Yeah, did that ever
Merge
make it in?
into
I didn't see it in the platform,
It
but
hasn't happened yet. I don't know
Yeah.
what the timeframe will be, but it's going to become part of it.
you might look into that. That's a really cool tool. It does also, it hides even more of this. The reason that I'm not as big a fan is that, especially like in the charter world, we do a fair amount of manipulation of the stuff that's coming in and going out.
Yeah.
So I like that this is like the halfway house of that. It allows me to do a fair amount of manipulation, but also kind of hides some of the more redundant stuff that we do. John Papa's makes a lot of assumptions about how you're going to put data in and get it back out. But you might look into that because it might already do some of that stuff. So.
All right. And the second question, you didn't really mention actions, so basically the process how we get data from, and yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, my question was like, for example, if I have different requests, like some requests I get data and I filter it like automatically, I never fetch it just, and I automatically filter it, let's say by age or by something, and should I create several stores for that?
So stores
basic.
know if it's the same type of entity object, right?
Yeah,
A user
exactly.
is a user, it's always stored as a user. If
Yeah.
you're gonna do filtering, that's why I typically suggest that you just store everything unless there's a specific use case. And like I said, these are all the things that you kind of have to judge for yourself about how you do
Yeah.
stuff. Like in my case, we only use entity on one of the 5 states that we manage actively.
Okay.
Because the rest are too complex for what it's doing.
Oh, okay.
But I typically argue get everything, and then in the selectors is where you would build that sort of filtering logic into.
Yeah.
Because those are memoirs, every time you update the parent entity, the entire collection, those selectors then are immediately going to be available with all that new information. So
Okay.
they're really great for that sort of use case. If your concern is performance and I only ever want to call these particular things, if they're going to replace each other, entity is a great option for that, right? Like this replaces everything, or you remove all and replace everything. If you want to maintain separate collections of the
Yeah.
same entity, that's where it gets a little tougher. This is really designed primarily for one state, one object, it be a collection. The advanced usage stuff I kind of talked about briefly, about how you would select certain states, you could pass it the state to then give me the return from the selectors. That might be a use case where you would use that. That would be a good scenario where your state's a bit more advanced than the standard interface. So you could have multiple state objects with different interfaces. So say filtered state 1, filtered
Yeah.
state 2, and then when I create my adapter, I just pass in what I need and it gives me the selectors for that scenario, and you can then maintain it one state object. I would then start arguing though, you're getting into a level of complexity in your
Yeah.
state that's not maintainable.
All right, thank you.
But it's up to your call. Anyone else? I guess not. So, well, thank you everybody. It was fun to give you a talk.